Okay, so we left off, I think, looking at beer production and how some of the beer brewing industry can take advantage of the gibberellic acids when they're getting the starch of the barley further broken down. So it's easier for the yeast that they inoculate into those big vats to start fermenting the ground up barley seeds, the malt. And so some of them will kind of put in a little bit of gibberellic acid to really stimulate the breakdown of starch. Because then once that happens, it breaks it down into sugars, simple sugars, and then the yeast have a much easier time grabbing the simple sugars, pushing that into glycolysis and start running fermentation reactions from that. And of course, the beer brewing industry is getting that alcohol produced in that fermentation pathway. So that's definitely something that can be used. Sometimes, though, you don't always want to have gibberellic acid functioning in a plant. You might want to try to thwart that process. So if you think about, there are some commercial plants where you don't want some big plant. That's not what makes the profit. Sometimes, especially around this time of year, if you think about chrysanthemums that are for sale right now, a lot of potted chrysanthemums for your landscape and patio, because they're very cold hardy, they're very pretty, the flowers last a long time. Poinsettias in the Christmas season, you have, if you've looked at them carefully, they're very compact plants, and they do that on purpose so that all of the flowers and the brightly colored leaf, those are bracts, the bright red and white, are clustered together then very nicely so that they look very colorful and very appealing to our visual aesthetics. If you've ever kept your poinsettia plant, if you have one, and then after the holiday season is done, you keep it alive, you will see that it will start to get very leggy and grow tall. And that's its normal growth pattern. And so before they sell it off to companies for all of us to buy and enjoy, they do create through the use of inhibitors to keep that the stem shorter so that you get a more compact plant. This is also of great interest to people who own golf courses. If you think about how much labor cost and all the cost of mowing, all the lawnmowers and all of that to mow down your greens so that the grass is super short for golf. And you think about all the golf courses worldwide, it's a very popular sport. Boy, if you could engineer turf grass that didn't need to be mowed, you'd be a billionaire. And they are working on that. And so they're also working in the agricultural industry, trying, especially with cereal grains, that when they form the grains, whether it be rice or oats or barley, it's preferable to have a nice, steady, strong stalk, because that way the grains can be held upright very nicely and it's easier for the machines to come along and harvest or even to hand harvest. And also, if the plant puts too much energy into a tall stem, it's less energy going into the cereals that you want to harvest. And so again, having a shorter stem is advisable. And so you can do that through a couple of different ways. You took and applied gibberellic acid to your pea plants to get the stems to really increase, those dwarfs to really increase in stem length. But you can also spray plants to inhibit. As long as the receptors are fully functioning, you can create gibberellic acid inhibitors and spray your plants. And that's what they did here with wheat. And a little too much there on the last one. Probably that would not be harvestable by machine. That one's a little too small, but anyways, they were trying to prove the point that depending on the dose, you can create plants that are more short and still produce enough of the grains. So looking at it for food production, and one idea that has been proposed for the turf grass idea is this putting in extra genes into the turf grass plant so that it breaks down gibberellic acid faster and more efficiently. And so you're just kind of ramping up the breakdown of gibberellic acid in those plants. And so in that regard, the plant just doesn't get much gibberellic acid exposure because it keeps getting broken down. And so then your plants will stay really short. So that's one strategy they're looking at for genetically engineered turf grass. As far as I know, they still haven't got that out for sale anywhere, but whoever gets that through the finish line first is going to be rich. They're also looking at with abscisic acid. We've learned about that as very important for drought responses. So the gibberellic acid's made in the roots, where the roots are sensing drought. Abscisic acid gets made in the roots, gets sent all the way up to the stomata and tells the stomata to close down. Well, what they're finding now is that if they take plants and spray them with a low dose of abscisic acid before a drought, it actually helps the plant make it through the drought. And so the fancy way to say that is drought tolerance. It displays drought tolerance. And so that was really encouraging that they could predict, with the weather forecast, we're going to have a drought coming, so we'll spray with abscisic acid. The downside of that is it's expensive. Abscisic acid is expensive. So what they've done, a company has created an abscisic acid kind of mimic called obabactin, and it mimics abscisic acid well enough that you can do the same thing. You can spray your plants before the drought hits with this synthetic chemical, and what it does is it's just really good at binding to the protein receptor for abscisic acid and is even better than straight ahead abscisic acid. And so this allows for it to be, really successful, and you don't need to apply very much either. So they're looking at these ideas to help plants make it through predicted droughts during the growing season. And so these types of ideas, that's once you understand some of the physiology of these hormones, then being able to manipulate that for whatever you're trying to get from that plant, whether it's be, food or medicinal properties. But that work on obabactin was just published a few years ago, and very successful research that was published. And so that's something that can be easily, purchased and used. Okay, so that's the information on kind of hormones from the plant's perspective and, what they do for the plant, and then how we've been using them in working with plants. So I'm going to stop there on that. I want to get into the next topic, which should be the secondary metabolite that should be visible in EduCat. So this is a huge topic. Secondary metabolites. I mean, this is incredibly vast. So I am just going to be scratching the surface on this. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what are secondary metabolites just from a chemical perspective, and give you a little bit of taste of that before we start delving into how do plants make these secondary metabolites to defend themselves, and primarily against herbivores, mammals, including us, and bacteria and fungi that are trying to attack the plant. And so it's a little, I'm going to have some kind of broad things to say, and then I'll give some examples of these different secondary metabolites. But from a plant's perspective, we certainly know that plants can't just get up and move away from something that's attacking them. They can't pull out a gun or do anything like that to fight. And so they have to be able to not only have really good ability to sense what's going on around them, but then ways to very quickly defend themselves if that's what the interpretation of what's happening to them is called for. They have all kinds of organisms that want to eat them and attack them. Viruses, fungi, bacteria, nematodes are little tiny worms that you can barely see with the naked eye. Mites and other insects, mammals, all kinds of things that want to chew on the plant and besides insects. And so you have certain things that the plant is just naturally born with called innate defenses. We have that too, like intact skin that keeps a barrier to our outside world. They have a similar thing with intact epidermis, a nice waxy covering. So you have just innate defenses. Their cell walls can be considered an innate defense, how strong they are and impervious to a lot of different organisms trying to attack. So yes, certainly the plant is just kind of born with some innate defenses, so to speak. But then we're going to be zeroing in on the things that the plant does in the moment, that in response to a signal, hey, I'm getting attacked, and I'm getting attacked by an insect, or oh, nope, I'm getting attacked by a bunny rabbit. And they need to be able to perceive that, interpret it, and then respond appropriately. And almost all the time, one of the response patterns is making a secondary metabolite to try to persuade whatever's attacking them to stop or to kill it or to move on. And so they have to think about, or, the plant has to be able to sense that kind of fine detail and respond with the correct secondary metabolite. And so we call these induced responses. So when you think about responses, we can say they're induced, which means they're in response to something happening to them, like a caterpillar chewing on them. And then the other idea is constitutive. If we say, oh, that's a constitutive response or that's a constitutive thing, what we mean is it's always being produced, usually at a very low level. It's always being produced. All right. So you have constitutive versus inducible. So we're going to be zooming into these secondary metabolites that are inducible by them being attacked in some way. So the definition of a secondary metabolite, they typically will say something like this. There's no direct role in the primary metabolic reaction. So we have plants doing primary reactions and secondary reactions. When we say primary, we're talking about things that the plant does through its day to survive, like do photosynthesis, do glycolysis and respiration. So those types of ideas are, they're doing it on a minute by minute thing. It's just part of their everyday life, and they do it to stay alive. Secondary metabolites, on the other hand, are only made in response to something, so it can be very infrequent, hopefully, from the plant's perspective, where they won't be doing it on a minute by minute basis. Now, there are some secondary metabolites that can be considered part of primary metabolic pathways. There are some exceptions, so this isn't, totally black and white, but it's a good kind of rule of thumb to think about. Another thing they say about secondary metabolites is that it has restricted distribution in the plant. And yeah, that's pretty much true. So basically what they're saying is that if, for example, a caterpillar is chewing on a plant leaf, that leaf will have an upswing in a particular secondary metabolite. And so I think that's kind of what they're thinking about. It's at the site of attack that you see that secondary metabolite getting made. But I'd like to caution you on this because now we realize that secondary metabolites can move to other areas of the plant body and warn other parts of the plant body that something's happening. So this is a little older definition. It has some usefulness to think about, but we've realized that there's more of a systemic response as well, and we'll talk about that. Secondary metabolites are usually made against pathogens of some sort. When I say that, I'm very broad in the way I think about pathogen. It could be a bacteria, it could be fungus, it could be a caterpillar or a myriad of other types of insects. It could be a mammal chewing on it. So there's all kinds of ideas. We also see that plants will do this against other plants. They will produce secondary metabolites, often in competition. One of the classic examples is the black walnut tree. If you've ever seen a black walnut in a mixed forest ecosystem, you tend to see kind of this beautiful black walnut kind of off on its own. And you look around it and there's not a whole lot of other plant growth around it, but further away, there's all kinds of other plants around. And so that pattern showed up enough over time in different forests where they're like, okay, what's going on with that? And they realized that black walnut is very good at excreting secondary metabolites into the soil through its roots, and it causes other nearby plants to not be able to grow too close. So the fancy word for that is allelopathy, where you have plants defending themselves against other plants, primarily for space and access to sunlight. And so black walnut is a very obvious example if you've ever seen a beautiful black walnut tree in a forest. They're usually kind of a loner. Secondary metabolites are involved in certain phases of the plant's life cycle, specifically when you get pollination. So when angiosperms, especially well, it's most heavily studied in angiosperms, when you have the flower being produced, pollination has to occur. And then if pollination was successful, you get fertilization, and then eventually seeds start to form inside the fruit. And so all of that pollination and seed dispersal, getting pollination to happen, secondary metabolites play a role in that. And also seed dispersal, getting organisms to pick up on the fruit and take it away and eat it and disperse the seeds. Secondary metabolites are involved in that too. So they are important to the plant. It's not just plant defense against pathogens in general, but that's what we're going to tend to focus on in the next topic after this. So this chart is looking at the three main groups of secondary metabolites, and they have it linked to the primary, okay, the primary metabolism going on, okay? So up top is the pink, and they're looking at yeah, some of them showing glycolysis products and the TCA cycle. And so, yeah, that's all primary. And then you start talking about the shikimic acid and malonic acid, all of that down here in the kind of the green. Now we're getting into secondary metabolite production. And so the gold boxes are the three big groups that we'll talk about of secondary metabolites. So you have the phenolic compounds, the terpenes, and the nitrogen-containing products. So this is not a chemistry class. We're not going to get into huge detail on this. This section, I'm going to give you kind of an overview of some examples of these different classes of secondary metabolites and some examples of maybe how you might be familiar with them as well. So phenolic compounds, that's one big category. Lots of compounds fit into here. You may have been hearing about polyphenolic compounds, polyphenols. That's a big hot topic right now in human health. We're realizing that polyphenolics are very, seem to be a very healthy secondary metabolite for us to have in our diet. And so the basic structure of a phenol is over there in the top right. And I'm not going to get into the pathways. I'm not going to expect you to know the pathways, but for those of you who are in chemistry, if this helps you in any way, great. But you see that basically the way they think about it is that it's got a phenylalanine intermediate in the process of making the different phenols. But again, I'm not getting into the pathway, but if you've had this information in another class and that helps you, that's great. But when you look at some of the different phenolic compounds, like we've talked about some of these already. We've looked at caffeic acid, for example, and that plants can secrete that from their roots. actively. You have the salicylic acid. That's actually a considered a plant hormone. Vanillin flavoring, vanilla flavoring is actually vanillin. And so you have, and this is just a slight taste of it, of what you can find in terms of the phenolic, some of the simpler phenolics. You might have heard of coumarin. You might know someone who is taking a coumarin drug. And they do that because it's an anticoagulant. It helps thin the blood. And so people who are under risk of heart attack or cardiovascular disease, often they'll get prescribed coumarin. And this is a phenolic compound. You might have heard it called warfarin. That's the drug name, common name. And so another thing that you may not know is when you smell that lovely smell of fresh mowed hay, the coumarin is what you're smelling. Yeah, it's what's being given off by the plant. And so when hay is getting mowed, if you think about it, you go along with a mower and you chop off the stems. That's a wounding event. All right. And so it thinks it's getting attacked. And so releasing off the coumarin is a part of that process of its response to being attacked. So caffeic acid and ferulic acid, we talked about how caffeic acid is, some plants can secrete that into the soil for better access to iron when they have issues with iron uptake. And some of the allelopathic compounds, like the black walnut tree, when they release allelopathic compounds, some of those are phenolics. Whoops. And so, it can be, in the case of coumarin, it's a volatile. You can have that coming out through the, in a kind of a gaseous form. You can have it being released through the soil. So there's different chemicals, it depends. Flavonoids are part of the phenolic group, and we've talked about those. Flavonoids are important pigments that the plant produces for flower and fruit, primarily coloring, to attract pollinators and seed dispersers. It also has the ability to inhibit microbes, and so that can be important. We'll talk about phytoalexins later, but phytoalexins are a group of phenolic compounds that some plants make very efficiently and very quickly to defend themselves against bacteria and fungi that are attacking them. So we'll talk about those. There's also some phenols that are considered insecticidal and can be used to ward off, you can spray it for insect control. So you might have heard of rotenone. That's a commercial product that you can buy. And there's even some flavonoids that are being looked at for anti-cancer. They're also polyphenolics, I mentioned already. Those are also something that has been looked at as powerful antioxidants. This one is not such a great idea for some organisms. So they found that sheep, if they are set free to graze in certain areas on clover, they found that they would get sick and they would have problems with conceiving. So the female sheep would have problems. And what they realized is that it acts as an anti-estrogenic, some of the polyphenols in the clover. And so it messed with the mammal, the sheep, reproduction. And so the isoflavonoids actually made the sheep unable. I think within a time frame, if you take them off the clover, and but they've had issues with infertility. I know certain plants can also cause miscarriage with cattle and sheep if they get into the wrong fields. And so it always makes me wonder when I took a road trip out west and I would see this just miles of no fenced areas, but cattle grazing everywhere. And you just wonder about what are they getting into, because they're just like free roaming. And the ranchers don't have great control on what they start eating unless they've done a thorough survey of their whole entire area, which is massive. So anyways, um, so these flavonoids, there's different groups. You don't need to memorize all the different groups, so I would probably just refer to them as flavonoids. But if you're in chemistry, you probably know that there's so-called flavonoids and flavonols, and they are phenolics that are able to absorb light that our eyes can't pick up on, but other organisms that interact with plants can. And so if you think about bees going to pollinate flowers, for example, they can see some of these pigments. We don't pick up on them because it's not within the 400 to 700 nanometer range of what our retina can pick up on. So when we look at a flower, it can look very different to us compared to how like a bee looks at it. They see something very different. We can see these not just in flowers, they can be showing up in leaves. They think in that regard, they act as a way for the leaves to withstand ultraviolet damage. And if you have these pigments absorbing the ultraviolet, it does help protect them. It's kind of like melanin in our skin. That pigment helps protect us. So your melanin turns a darker color, and that's a safer reaction than having that light energy attacking our DNA and proteins. We also talked about how some plants excrete flavonoids to promote nitrogen fixing bacteria to come to their roots. And so they see that flavonoids can be used as a chemical signal too. So lots of different options for some of these chemicals from the plant's perspective. So going back to the idea that bees can see things differently than us. So when we look at a black-eyed Susan flower, that's what we see. For a bee, this is what it looks like. And so very, very different. You can see how it kind of accentuates the middle of the flower, and that's what they're going for. The flower wants the bee to visit right toward the center in order for maximum pollination to occur. And so very, very different sometimes what the pollinator sees compared to us. You might have heard of tannins. Those are polyphenolics. And again, this is something very useful for the plant. Plants produce tannins. They are considered a general toxin. They're very bitter. Insects chewing on that, it's very bitter. And it does tend to make herbivores want to kind of like move on and not keep chewing in that spot. Then if the insect actually ingests enough tannin as they're chewing along, it can make the insect sick. It can slow their overall growth. They might not be able to complete their life cycle either. And so that's just kind of a general good defense by the plant. You see this happening. Tannins get deposited pretty nicely in the tree trunks of trees. You can imagine that there's lots of organisms that might want access to some of the nutrition there. That's why unripe fruit tastes so bitter to you when you bite into an apple that's totally green and it's very astringent and bitter. It's because of the tannins. So that's to get you to deter you from continuing to eat it, because the seeds aren't quite ready yet. And so the plant doesn't want you to eat the fruit until the seeds are ready. And so they keep everything unripe, they camouflage it, usually make it green, so it blends in with the leaves, lots of tannins. So you'll take a bite and go, ugh, and not want to eat it. And that gives the plant a chance to fully ripen up and get their seeds good to go. So we definitely have an aversion to the taste of tannins in high enough doses anyways. it tends to, if you ingest it, it binds to proteins, not non-specifically. But basically what it does is it starts messing with some of the digestive enzymes in the insect that might be chewing on the leaf, for example, or in the gut. And again, it just makes that insect sick. It makes them learn to avoid those types of food choices. There are some insects and animals that have gotten around that a little bit. So they get high concentrations of proline in their saliva, and that actually helps to inactivate the tannins and make it so it's not bitter to them. And so it's this continual kind of coevolution between plants and all the organisms that want to eat plants one way or the other. You have these adaptations going on back and forth, and it's a continual process back and forth. We'll talk more about that when we get into how plants defend themselves. So here you're looking at a tree trunk where you see all that dark section. Those are tannins being laid down in that area to try to really preserve, essentially, it's preserving that section of the tree. So it's much harder for fungi and bacteria in particular to get in there and do damage. And you ingest tannins. Apples have a high dose of tannins. That's one reason why actually apples are good for you. Polyphenols are good for you. Tea has high polyphenol. Pomegranates, that's why pomegranates popularity went up. They realized that they have a lot. Red wine also has a lot of polyphenols and tannins. But again, now the newer research is saying any amount of alcohol is not great for you. So I'm not advocating you drink red wine. They make non-alcoholic red wine. That's an option. But basically, if you've ever tasted red wine, if you're over 21 and you've tasted red wine, you might have that kind of dryness in your mouth. Some people say it just kind of sucks the water off your tongue. It's very dry. That's the tannins doing that for you. And so, you know, it has a lot of tannins if you have that kind of mouthfeel when you sip the wine. What they're finding in research is that the tannins are helping with keeping your blood vessels relaxed and open, which is what most of us want. We don't want constricted blood vessels because that can lead to blood clots and strokes and heart attacks. So grape juice can do the same thing because it's actually the skin of the grapes or the seed of the grapes, although no, most grapes are seedless, so you can't really do that. But the skin of the grape, you can just drink grape juice and get the same effect essentially of getting access to tannins that way. And so when you ferment wine in oak barrels, you're also getting a good dose of tannins from the oak barrel. And so you have a lot of ramped up tannins. The other thing that's been touted in red wine is that resveratrol that I mentioned before, which is, again, it's a different kind of flavonoid. It's not a tannin, but it is also found in red wine. But okay, I think, oh, we got to stop there. Sorry, we ran a little over. Thank you for your patience. We'll stop there. And the next group we'll get into are the terpenes. We'll talk a little bit about those.